They weren't battles of glory, they were storms of fear. When you picture a medieval battlefield, it's easy to imagine knights in shining armor, clashing heroically beneath banners and sunlight. But the truth is far darker. These were not scenes of honor and chivalry. They were chaotic theaters of survival, soaked in blood, smoke, and noise so deafening, it blurred the line between life and death. Each clang of steel meant a heartbeat closer to oblivion. Each scream was a reminder that courage and terror often shared the same breath. In this story, we'll strip away the myths and enter the mud, the panic, and the human reality of war in the Middle Ages. We'll walk where soldiers stood, not as heroes of legend, but as men of flesh and fear, caught in the merciless rhythm of battle. This is what medieval battles were really like. Part 1, The Gathering Before War. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time before the gunpowder smoke, before the roar of cannons, before the word strategy came with a PowerPoint. Back to the Middle Ages, when the most advanced battle technology was a well-sharpened stick attached to a slightly better stick. Let's dim the lights, settle in, and wander toward the quiet moments before the chaos, the gathering before war. Because before the clash of swords, there were always the long, anxious days of waiting, and the faint realization that most of the men in your army had never actually been in a fight before. It's often easy in our modern imaginations to picture medieval warfare as a straightforward affair. Two armies meet, trumpets sound, horses charge, someone yells for glory. But in reality, it was a logistical nightmare dressed up in chainmail. First, there was the calling of banners, a phrase that sounds regal and efficient, but really meant months of noblemen sending messengers on horseback to every direction of their fiefdoms, demanding their vassals show up with a handful of men and at least one functional spear between them. The problem was that medieval Europe didn't have anything resembling a standing army. No professional soldiers, no government-issued rations, no military discipline, unless you count the occasional lecture from a bishop about behaving Christianly, while stabbing one another. Instead, the armies were built like a medieval group project. Everyone was technically participating, but most people brought as little as possible and hoped someone else had remembered the tent. Let's take, for example, an English army in the 14th century, say, the one that fought at Crecy. When King Edward Roman III called his men to war, his army wasn't so much an organized force as it was a traveling festival of mud, egos, and unpaid bills. Each nobleman was expected to bring along his own little contingent, knights, squires, and the occasional archer who knew which end of the bow to use. They'd all travel to the muster point, usually late, because their horses needed feeding, or the roads were flooded, or they just didn't particularly feel like fighting that month. And so, for weeks, fields outside small towns filled with tents, smoke from cooking fires, and the sound of men complaining about rations that were mostly hard bread, salted meat, and something that might once have been ale. It wasn't glamorous. It smelled faintly of sweat, onions, and despair. But there was excitement, too, the kind that sits uneasily in your stomach. Many of these men had never left their villages before. The idea of traveling across France or Flanders was thrilling right up until they realized that travel mostly involved walking through ankle-deep mud, carrying 30 pounds of gear, and no spare socks. Commanders spent this time trying to turn their collection of feudal participants into something resembling an army, which meant endless drills, shouted orders, and more than a few injuries from men accidentally stabbing their own comrades during practice. Knights, of course, were proud to show off their armor, heavy, polished, and ruinously expensive, but it wasn't nearly as practical as films like to pretend. Underneath all that gleaming metal was a man sweating profusely, praying he wouldn't fall off his horse, because once you were down, getting up again required either help from your squire or divine intervention. The archers were another matter entirely. Most were peasants trained since boyhood with the longbow. a weapon that could pierce armor at 200 yards if your shoulders didn't give out first. The English longbowmen were feared across Europe, though mostly because they could ruin a knight's expensive day in seconds. They weren't exactly elegant soldiers. Contemporary chroniclers described them as rough, foul, mouthed and fond of drinking, but they were effective, which, in the Middle Ages, was good enough. Let's not forget the camp followers, the unsung civilians who trailed behind every army. They were the cooks, washerwomen, blacksmiths, merchants, and, occasionally, people providing less official services. They weren't paid much, if at all, but they kept the army alive, washing clothes, mending boots, and sometimes scavenging what little food could be found. A medieval army on the march was less a fighting force and more a wandering village, a slow, noisy migration of thousands of people, animals, and carts that clogged every road for miles. And as they gathered, rumors spread like wildfire, stories of the enemy's cruelty, whispers of saints who would bless the army if they carried the right relic. Some soldiers tied charms to their belts, bits of bone, locks of hair, or tiny crosses, desperate for any edge in a world where survival seemed increasingly unlikely. By the time both sides were ready, the real work began, deciding where to fight. Contrary to modern belief, battles weren't usually planned with maps and tactics. They were accidents of geography and timing. Maybe one side caught the other while crossing a river. Maybe someone ran out of food and had to move. Or maybe the commanders simply wanted to end the endless, exhausting waiting. Because waiting was the true enemy of morale. Imagine standing for weeks in the cold, in armor that rubbed your skin raw, listening to distant thunder that might be the weather or the enemy's drums. The tension built slowly, day after day, until the first trumpet sounded, and suddenly the waiting was over. But let's linger a little longer just before that first clash. The night before a battle was strange. Quiet, sometimes eerily so. Fires burned low, men whispered prayers, and horses shuffled nervously in the dark. Chroniclers often described this stillness, a kind of suspended moment where even the most hardened knights felt their stomachs twist. They would take confession, write last letters, or if they were less pious, drink until they could forget what morning would bring. There's something deeply human about that pause. No matter how much armor you wore, no matter how loud you shouted about honor or duty, every man on that field knew he could be dead by noon. Let's drift for a moment to France in 1415, the eve of Agincourt. The English army, tired and sick, faced overwhelming odds. It had rained for days, turning the fields into muck. The men were exhausted, hungry, and wet, and yet in the dark they sang softly, hymns and drinking songs, anything to fill the silence. Across the field the French nobles were confident, even arrogant. They spent the night feasting, laughing, boasting about how easily they would crush the invaders. They were, as history tends to remind us, catastrophically wrong. It's a familiar story in medieval warfare. One side underestimates the other, assuming that birth and armor are enough to guarantee victory. But the battlefield rarely cared for titles. Mud could humble anyone. In the morning, the trumpets would sound, and everything that had been human, fear, hope, friendship, would dissolve into movement. Men would form ranks, hoist banners, and prepare to kill strangers they had never met. And in that first hour, every plan, every sermon, every noble promise would unravel into a chaos no commander could control. But we'll get to that later. For now, imagine the calm before it all begins, the smell of damp earth, the low murmur of prayer, the soft creak of leather armor as men shift their weight and wait for dawn. The battlefield is not yet alive, but it's breathing, slowly, heavily, as if the earth itself knows what's coming. And so, that's where we'll leave them, gathered in their thousands, banners fluttering faintly in the early light. Each man a fragile piece of history about to be swallowed by noise and dust, because tomorrow they fight. Part 2. The battlefield environment if you're still awake. and I'm genuinely impressed if you are. Let's drift a little further into the medieval battlefield itself. Not the heroic version painted on a castle wall, but the real thing. The ground was not flat, dry, or particularly inviting. It was usually uneven, trampled farmland, a patchwork of churned mud, broken fences, and what had once been someone's cabbage field, the kind of place where your boots filled with water before dawn and never quite dried again. You can almost imagine the smell. A blend of wet soil, animal sweat, cheap ale, and the faint metallic scent of iron that always seems to linger before battle. The Middle Ages didn't have the luxury of clean staging grounds. Armies fought wherever they happened to meet, valleys, marshes, riverbanks, often in places that any sensible commander would have avoided entirely. But sensible was rarely a word used to describe medieval warfare. Most of the time, the environment decided the outcome long before the first arrow was loosed. Take the Battle of Agincourt, for instance, 1415. The English army, half, starved and outnumbered, found itself facing a much larger French force in the middle of a soggy field. It had been raining for days, and the ground had turned to soup. The French knights, resplendent in their heavy armor, sank almost immediately. What should have been a proud cavalry charge became an awkward, metallic shuffle. Some of them were trampled by their own men before they even reached the English lines. And so, ironically, the battlefield that day was less about courage and more about mud. Mud so deep that men drowned in it, quite literally suffocating beneath their armor. It wasn't glorious. It was gravity, doing what gravity does best. But not every battlefield was a miserable swamp. Some were dusty plains, where the summer heat shimmered and the air felt thick enough to chew. Others were forests, claustrophobic and confusing, where arrows came from unseen hands and horses balked at the shadows. The choice of terrain mattered enormously. Commanders who understood this, the ones who knew how to let the land fight for them, tended to win more than those who didn't. Unfortunately, medieval commanders were often nobles with titles rather than talent. And if you were wondering, yes, nepotism existed long before LinkedIn. A nobleman's birthright could make him a general, even if the only strategy he knew was ride toward the shiny things. And so, many armies found themselves positioned in precisely the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. The terrain wasn't the only challenge. The weather could turn on you faster than a French ally in the 15th century. Heavy rain meant bows were useless, wet strings slackened, and arrows went nowhere. Snow turned the ground into a mirror of misery, and heat could bake soldiers in their armor until they fainted mid-charge. A knight in full plate could weigh anywhere between 50 and 70 pounds more, if you counted the layers of padding underneath. Marching in that under the summer sun wasn't gallant. It was exhausting. One chronicler described knights at the Battle of Najera in 1367 fainting as if dead men long before the fighting began. And yet, the legends we tell never mention that. They prefer the image of shining steel and fearless eyes, not a red-faced noble wheezing into his visor and wondering if anyone would notice if he just lay down for a moment. Then there was the noise. Even before the battle began, the field was alive with sound, the clank of armor, the snorting of horses, the nervous muttering of men whispering prayers to saints who were probably quite busy that day. Trumpets blared, drums rolled, banners snapped in the wind. And over it all, you could hear the commanders shouting orders that half the army couldn't understand. Because, of course, not everyone spoke the same language. An English host might include Welsh longbowmen, Irish auxiliaries, and mercenaries from Flanders or Germany. It was less one army, one heart, and more a multilingual misunderstanding with swords. The air itself was different. Thick, heavy, full of dust or mist. If you've ever stood in a crowded concert field in the rain, multiply that by a few thousand men and add horses, fear, and no hygiene. The stench was legendary. Chroniclers described it delicately as unpleasant. Modern historians are more honest. It was the smell of sweat, manure, spoiled rations, and too many people packed together for too long. Hygiene wasn't a concept medieval armies excelled at. There were no latrines, just trenches, ditches, or the nearest bush. It wasn't unusual for soldiers to stand knee-deep in their own filth by the end of a campaign, and when the wind shifted, carrying that smell across the lines, you can be certain that any romantic notion of chivalry vanished entirely. Still, there was something eerie about those moments before the clash, a low hum across the field, tens of thousands of heartbeats thudding in time, waiting for someone to move first. In some cases, the two armies could even see each other across the field, just distant enough that faces blurred, but close enough to spot the glitter of helmets and the rising steam of horses. It must have felt unreal to look out at an ocean of humanity and realize that, within an hour, many of those shapes would no longer be standing. And yet, men joked, they adjusted straps, they picked at their meals and told each other they weren't afraid, because what else could they do? Courage in most cases was simply pretending not to panic. Let's drift for a moment to a more specific field, Hastings, 1066. It was October. The ground dry at dawn, turned slick as blood and rain mixed through the day. William's Norman forces faced Harold's English army on Senlac Hill. The English held the high ground, forming a shield wall so tight, it was said, an apple could rest on their spears. The Normans charged uphill, slipping in the muck, horses stumbling, riders swearing under their breath in Old French. The hill itself became a weapon. Gravity worked in the English favor, until, of course, Harold was shot in the eye, and everything went downhill both literally and figuratively. That's the thing about medieval battlefields. They were living things. Every mound, every ditch, every puddle of water could decide the fate of kings. It's worth remembering that armies didn't just appear on these fields. They had been walking for days, sometimes weeks, to get there. Every mile was a struggle. Roads were uneven and full of ruts. Horses lost shoes, carts broke, supplies ran short. And when the soldiers finally arrived, the ground they stood on was often already ruined by thousands of trampling feet. It wasn't a glorious arrival. It was relief tinged with dread. They would set up camp wherever they could. Tents if they were lucky, open sky if not. And then they'd wait, because war, for all its noise and chaos, was mostly waiting. By morning, the dew would cling to armor, dampening everything. The horses would snort clouds of breath into the cold air. And somewhere out there, the enemy was doing the exact same thing. Sometimes the armies could hear each other, distant shouts, the rattle of weapons. Other times fog would roll in, and they would vanish from sight altogether. That fog was both a curse and a comfort. It hid the enemy, yes, but it also hid the reality of what was coming. And perhaps that's why so many soldiers said their prayers then, not because they expected to be saved, but because the fog made them feel small enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone up there was listening. So when we talk about medieval battles, it's not just about the swords and the tactics. It's about the place. The mud that clung to every step, the smell that never left your nose, the cold that seeped through mail and bone alike. It was as much a fight against the environment as it was against the enemy. The battlefield wasn't just a backdrop. It was the first and most unforgiving opponent. And so, as dawn broke and the first trumpets sounded, every man on that field already carried exhaustion in his bones. They had slept little, eaten worse. The weight of armor dug into their shoulders. The damp air clung to their throats. They looked out across the mist and waited for orders that might seal their fate. It's a strange thing, isn't it, to realize that every grand victory or tragic defeat in our history books began with this. A handful of tired, muddy men standing in a cabbage field, squinting at the horizon and wondering if this was really worth it. Part 3. The tactics and formations tonight. we're drifting deeper into the heart of medieval battle. Past the waiting, past the nervous prayers, past the smell of damp leather and misplaced confidence. We've reached the moment when the quiet finally breaks, when banners lift, horns sound, and everyone pretends to know what's going on. Because this was the world of medieval tactics and formations, though calling them tactics might be generous. It often looked less like a grand plan and more like a series of unfortunate guesses, performed by men in heavy metal shirts who hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Still, there was structure. At least there was supposed to be. The medieval battlefield was usually arranged into 3 divisions: the vanguard, the main body, and the rear guard. Sounds tidy, doesn't it? Like a well-organized lunch queue. Except, once the fighting started, these divisions tended to blend together like soup. Knights charged too soon, infantry advanced too late, and archers somewhere on the flank realized they'd run out of arrows exactly when things were getting interesting. But for a brief and shining moment before the chaos began, there was order. Commanders positioned their men carefully. Infantry in the center, archers on the flanks or slightly ahead. Cavalry held in reserve, a polite medieval term meaning, please wait until everyone else is nearly dead before showing off. Each formation had its own logic, usually the kind that sounded brilliant over wine, but fell apart the moment anyone yelled charge. Let's start with one of the most beloved tactics of the early Middle Ages, the shield wall. It was simple, brutal, and surprisingly effective. A line of men, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping like scales, forming a living barrier of wood and iron. Behind it, another line and another. A human wall that advanced or held its ground, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be in front of it. The idea was to stay close, very close, and hope your neighbor didn't lose his nerve. If one man broke formation, the whole wall could collapse like a poorly built fence. The Anglo-Saxons loved it, so did the Vikings. It was the medieval equivalent of locking your car doors and hoping the problem would go away. At Hastings in 1066, Harold's army stood in a shield wall for hours, holding firm against the Norman cavalry, until, of course, they decided to chase a retreating enemy downhill, because self-control is not a medieval strong suit, and the wall disintegrated in minutes. It's a recurring theme in medieval warfare. The tactic works perfectly until humans get involved. As warfare evolved, new formations appeared, and with them, new ways to make terrible mistakes. By the 13th and 14th centuries, armies began experimenting with combined forces, knights, infantry, and archers working together. In theory, at least. Take the English longbowmen, the pride of medieval England. They were positioned on the flanks, slightly ahead of the main line, where they could rain arrows into the advancing enemy. A well-trained archer could shoot 10 to 12 arrows a minute, enough to turn a cavalry charge into a very expensive disaster. At Crecy and Agincourt, they were the deciding factor. The English dug stakes into the ground to protect against cavalry, lined their archers in muddy fields, and simply let physics and patience do the rest. The French, on the other hand, charged uphill through rain and mud, in armor that weighed more than some of their servants. It went about as well as you'd expect. The longbow gave rise to one of the most terrifying sounds of the medieval world, the soft hiss of thousands of arrows cutting through air. Chroniclers said it darkened the sky. For a moment, the world itself seemed to exhale. Then, the sound of impact, a dull, wet percussion as iron-tipped shafts found their mark. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic, but it worked. Still, the English weren't the only ones to master formation warfare. Across the Channel, the Scots developed the schiltron, a dense forest of spears arranged in circular or rectangular formations. Imagine hundreds of men standing shoulder to shoulder, each holding a 12-foot spear angled outward like the spines of a very annoyed hedgehog. It was designed to stop cavalry, and it did. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce used the schiltron to devastating effect, turning English knights into confused, impaled traffic. But even the best formations had their flaws. The moment discipline wavered, or someone decided to be clever, things fell apart fast. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could ruin a plan like medieval cavalry. Knights were supposed to wait for the right signal. They were meant to charge as one, tightly packed, maximizing impact. Instead, many of them preferred to charge early, usually after spotting something shiny or personally insulting in the distance. Chivalric pride was a powerful motivator, but also a deeply inconvenient one. The perfect example, the Battle of Courtrai 1302. French knights, irritated by Flemish infantry who refused to stand aside, charged straight into a marsh. The ground gave way, horses floundered, men sank. The Flemish, mostly commoners armed with pikes and good footing, slaughtered them. It was called the Battle of the Golden Spurs, because afterward, so many gilded spurs were collected from the fallen knights that they practically paved the ground. Cavalry might have been unpredictable, but they were also the medieval equivalent of a tank, unstoppable in the right conditions, useless in the wrong ones. The key was timing. A well-timed cavalry charge could break an entire enemy line, but mistime it by even a few minutes, and you'd simply have a pile of very expensive corpses in designer armor. Coordination between the different arms, cavalry, archers, infantry, was rare and remarkable when it actually worked. And when it didn't, commanders usually blamed divine will, rather than their own lack of planning. Because of course they did. Let's drift for a moment to the 12th century, the age of crusaders, when knights from across Europe charged into the Holy Land under the assumption that God was basically their personal battle planner. In theory, their tactics were inspired by faith. In practice, they were mostly inspired by impatience. The Crusader cavalry charge was legendary. Lines of knights thundering forward beneath banners embroidered with crosses. But the real miracle was when they actually coordinated it properly. Too often, the charge began before the infantry had even arrived, leaving the knights surrounded and outnumbered. At Hatton, in 1187, the heat, the terrain, and poor planning destroyed the Crusader army long before the swords of Saladin's men did. It turns out that divine favor doesn't replace hydration. There were also defensive tactics, though they rarely received as much poetic attention. Holding the high ground was always desirable, as every medieval commander who ever slipped down a hill could confirm. Digging ditches, erecting stakes, or forming makeshift barricades, these were simple, effective measures. But nobles disliked them. They were considered unchivalrous, which is a fancy way of saying beneath me. Honor dictated that a real knight fought openly, ideally in full view of everyone important, while looking good doing it. So, naturally, the smarter, more practical commanders were often sneered at by their own peers. It's remarkable, really, how much medieval warfare was influenced by the ego of men who believed their lineage granted them tactical genius. Spoiler, it did not. And yet, amidst all this chaos and contradiction, there were moments of brilliance. Leaders who understood terrain, who used deception, patience, and timing instead of raw arrogance. William Marshall, for example, often called the greatest knight. He survived countless battles not because he was reckless, but because he was cautious. He believed that holding formation, watching for weakness, and striking only when the enemy tired was the true art of war. Of course, such subtlety didn't make for a good bard's tale, so his restraint was often rewritten as valor, because no one wants to sing about the man who wisely waited for the right opportunity. If you could stand on the sidelines of one of these medieval battles, safely, of course, you'd notice how strangely organized the chaos appeared from afar. Banners fluttering, groups of men moving like slow tides, a line of spears shimmering in the sun, archers loosing their arrows in graceful arcs. From a distance it almost looked choreographed. Up close it was anything but. Screams, confusion, the clash of metal on bone. Orders lost in the noise, flags disappearing in the smoke and dust. Formation, once the pride of the commander, dissolved within minutes. What remained was instinct, fight, flee, or freeze. And somehow, from that bedlam, outcomes still emerged. Victories were claimed, songs were written, but the truth was simpler and far messier. The side that broke last usually won. So when we speak of medieval tactics, it's worth remembering that beneath all the banners and bravado, the real battle was always between discipline and panic. The generals could plan, the soldiers could train, but once the first charge began, the battlefield belonged to chaos. And in the end, it was often not the bravest or the strongest who survived, but the luckiest. Part 4. The human cost and legacy if you're still awake, or just floating somewhere between sleep and thought tonight. We're settling into the quieter side of the battlefield. The noise has faded, the shouting is gone, and all that remains is the soft, heavy silence that follows when the last sword has stopped moving. This was the true face of medieval war, not the banners, not the songs, just the stillness and the people left behind to count what was lost. When we picture a medieval battle, it's tempting to imagine that it ended cleanly. One side victorious, one defeated. A trumpet call, perhaps a cheer, and everyone goes home for dinner. But reality, as always, was slower and far less cinematic. After the fighting stopped, the field was littered with the dead and dying. Horses groaned where they'd fallen, armor dented and stained, banners trampled into the dirt. The smell was the first thing anyone noticed. Iron, sweat, and decay. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't noble. It was just human, and in that moment, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. Most battles ended not with a climactic final charge, but with exhaustion. When enough men decided they'd rather live than continue, the line broke, the rest followed, and then came the rout, a word that sounds much cleaner than it was. It meant chaos. Men dropping weapons, fleeing, tripping over bodies, praying that no one chased them. If the enemy cavalry caught them, it was a massacre. Even when the victors were merciful, and they often weren't, the wounded rarely had a chance. Medieval medicine could do little for a deep cut, and nothing for infection. So those who didn't die on the field usually died a few days later, quietly, in a makeshift camp. But the battlefield wasn't just a place of loss. It was also an opportunity for looters, for scavengers, for anyone who understood that one man's tragedy was another man's income. After major battles, peasants crept back to the fields. They stripped armor, weapons, boots, anything of value. Bodies were turned over, searched, and left again. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they found jewelry or coins. If they were unlucky, they found something still breathing. And mercy wasn't always on the menu. It sounds grim, and it was. But for the poor, war was an economy. Every broken sword and blood-stained tunic had worth, because hunger didn't care about honor. The nobility, of course, experienced war differently. For them, death on the battlefield was tragic, yes, but also dignified. At least, that's what they told themselves. A knight's death could be poetic. Bards and chroniclers made sure of that. They'd write verses about courage, loyalty, and the sweet nobility of dying for one's lord. The truth was less graceful. Most knights died from suffocation inside their armor, or from being crushed in the mud under a horse that had tripped. They drowned in puddles. They bled out slowly because no one could reach the wound beneath all that steel. There was nothing noble about it, just the quiet indignity of mortality, even for the wealthy. And yet, despite the horror, battles continued generation after generation. Why? Because for the kings and princes who ordered them, war was a language, a form of conversation between rulers who couldn't agree on who had the nicer crown. Victory proved legitimacy, defeat required revenge, And so the cycle continued. Medieval rulers treated war the way some people treat family arguments, dramatic, repetitive, and entirely avoidable. Of course, not all kings were natural commanders. Some fancied themselves strategic geniuses. Others preferred to watch from a safe distance, ideally from a hill with a good view and an even better tent. King John of England, for example, lost more battles than he won, often for reasons that involved his own arrogance. At the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, his poor coordination helped cement his reputation as one of England's least inspiring monarchs. He blamed everyone but himself because of course he did. And still, when the next generation came, they did it all again. The human cost of these endless wars rippled far beyond the battlefield. Crops went untended, villages burned. Taxes rose, always taxes, because armor, horses, and sieges weren't cheap. For peasants, war wasn't something that happened elsewhere. It was something that passed through their fields, took their food, and occasionally burned their homes for good measure. When armies moved, they consumed everything in their path. They lived off the land, which really meant off the nearest villagers. If you were a peasant in the 14th century, and you saw two armies marching toward each other, you didn't pick a side. You just ran in the opposite direction and hoped no one noticed you had livestock. After a battle, kings and nobles liked to talk about glory. But for ordinary people, the aftermath was quieter and harder. Fields once soaked in blood had to be cleared and replanted. Families buried what they could find. Survivors returned home missing limbs, eyes, or friends. And yet life continued. Somehow, amid the destruction, people rebuilt. They patched roofs, reforged plows, and raised children who would grow up to fight in the next generation's war. It's remarkable, really, how persistence becomes a kind of heroism when everything else has failed. Every era of medieval warfare left its own scars. The Norman invasions reshaped England. The Crusades left cities emptied and economies twisted. The 100 Years' War drained entire kingdoms dry. And behind every one of those famous conflicts were people who never chose to be part of it. Peasants, merchants, scribes, and servants whose names vanished into the dust. History remembers kings and commanders. But the real story of medieval war lives in the silence after the last charge, in the hands that rebuilt the walls, and in the generations who learned to carry on despite it all. Even religion, that great justifier of medieval conquest, couldn't escape the human cost. Priests blessed soldiers before battle, promising divine favor to whichever side prayed harder. But after the fighting, they were also the ones burying the dead. Churchyards overflowed. Plague followed war like a shadow, feeding on the wounded and displaced. Every victory had a funeral attached. Still, sermons spoke of God's will, because nothing keeps people obedient like the promise that their suffering has purpose. And yet, strangely enough, out of this endless misery came progress. Necessity is the mother of invention, and war, tragically, is the father of organization. To fund their battles, kings developed better systems of taxation. To move their armies, they improved roads. To feed them, they built granaries and markets. So in a grim twist of irony, much of what became medieval civilization grew from the machinery of war. Even medicine learned from the wounds. Surgeons, who once only assisted barbers, gained experience treating injuries no one had seen before. They experimented with stitching, amputation, and bandaging crude beginnings, but beginnings nonetheless. In the wreckage of destruction, knowledge crept forward, but it wasn't progress that most people remembered, it was loss. Every village had a story of a father or son who never came home. Every monastery had its memorial list of benefactors fallen in service. Every battlefield became a haunting place, quiet, overgrown, and strangely peaceful. Centuries later, travelers would still find arrowheads in the soil, rusted spurs, fragments of bone. Reminders that even time couldn't quite bury the cost. The legacy of medieval warfare isn't just written in chronicles. It's written in the architecture of Europe, the castles, walls, and keeps that still stand today. Each stone tower was born from fear. Each moat was a memory of a siege, and each ruined fort on a lonely hilltop once echoed with the sounds of men who thought they'd change the world by force. Now they're just part of the landscape, silent, patient witnesses to the futility of it all. It's easy, from a distance, to romanticize it. To imagine knights gleaming in the sun, banners fluttering, honor upheld. But beneath every shining breastplate was a man sweating, frightened, and very aware that no amount of chivalry could stop a spear. The Middle Ages were an age of courage, yes, but also of confusion, of faith and fear entangled, of loyalty and folly marching side by side. And when we say medieval warfare, what we really mean is human nature under pressure. Greed, pride, fear, desperation, all wearing armor. Over the centuries, the weapons changed, gunpowder arrived, and with it, the end of the Knight's Age. Fortresses crumbled under cannon fire, infantry replaced the mounted elite, but the human cost that stayed the same. Every empire, every generation, rediscovered the same lesson, that war is far easier to begin than to understand, and that every victory leaves behind more ghosts than glory. So if you ever find yourself walking through a quiet meadow in Europe, one that seems too peaceful to be ancient, look closer. That ridge might once have been an earthwork, that hollow, the remains of a trench, and under the grass, the soil still remembers. Because time doesn't erase what happened. It just softens it like sleep over memory, and maybe that's the truest legacy of all. That despite the endless cycle of battles and banners people kept rebuilding, they found ways to live, to love, to make peace again, even if only for a season. For every sword that was forged, a plough was too. For every fortress razed, a church bell rang. And for every life taken by war, another quietly began in its shadow. So, tonight, as we leave the medieval battlefield behind, let's drift away from the noise and the chaos, back into that long silence that followed, the one filled with wind through grass, the faint smell of smoke, and the memory of voices that have long since faded. History is rarely kind, but it is deeply human. And even in its darkest moments, there's always something strangely tender about the way it endures. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow we'll wander somewhere else, somewhere quieter but never entirely still. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The torches have burned low. The field has gone quiet. And somewhere in the dark, a single banner still flutters in the wind, though no one's left to carry it. We've walked through mud and smoke, past knights and foot soldiers, and stood in the uneasy silence that always follows the fight, not as warriors, but as quiet observers of what people once did to prove themselves right, or powerful, or remembered. And maybe that's the softest truth of all, that history's loudest moments almost always end in silence. Just the sound of breathing, the earth reclaiming what men left behind. If you're still awake, thank you for wandering through the past with me tonight. And if you've already drifted off, well, maybe that's better. Sleep is kinder than most of the stories we tell. Next time, we'll travel somewhere new. Maybe to a medieval court where gossip mattered more than war, or to a forgotten castle whose stones remember more than they should. But for now, let it fade. Close your eyes. Let the noise of history quiet itself. And remember, the past isn't gone. It's just resting somewhere, waiting for the next dreamer to find it again. Good night, traveler, and sleep well beneath the weight of time.